Come on, let's go, hurry up and get in. The family, including my sister who was going abroad for her studies, was preparing to move. On the morning of departure day, I was abruptly woken up by my mother and shoved into a taxi as if rushed. Wait, wasn't the departure 3 hours later? Despite my confusion at the schedule being quite different from what I had heard beforehand, I couldn't say anything and silently took my seat. Huh? Despite my mother's rush, neither my sister nor father were in the taxi. Then, please. However, my mother, who later got into the taxi, drove off without any concern. Arriving at our destination, not the airport, but my grandparents' house. My mother dragged me out of the taxi and rang the intercom at my grandparents' house. The two of them were simply surprised to see us appear without any prior notice early in the morning. But my mother, without any concern, declared, "This child is useless to take along, so I'll leave her here," and tossed my luggage into my grandparents' house. Then, as she quickly got into the taxi, she only said, "Well, thank you. Except for matters of life and death, please don't contact me," and drove away. I stood there in shock, feeling like everything had gone dark before my eyes. Am I just a nuisance because I can't hear? Even though I thought that we could eventually understand each other because we're family, the despair at that moment was more painful and sorrowful than the day I lost my hearing in my childhood. I never thought someone could do something so awful. But from now on, Cindy can truly do what she loves. My grandmother, May, said softly as she hugged my shoulders. I had things I loved, but it was impossible. It's okay, Cindy. You'll see soon enough. My grandmother continued to encourage me with her gentle, enveloping smile. My name is Cindy, 22 years old. I live with my beloved job and my benefactors, my grandparents. Although I now lead a fulfilling life, my childhood was far from smooth sailing. I started living with my grandparents when I was 13. Before that, I lived with my parents and my sister, who was 2 years older. In our household, once you turned 3, you were required to start piano and violin lessons. This was a non-negotiable decision that couldn't be changed. Furthermore, the lessons were 7 times a week. Initially, they were 30 minutes each, but gradually increased to 45 minutes, then an hour. Before I knew it, my days were filled with music to the point where I couldn't play with friends outside of kindergarten. But I never felt resentful. Because I was always compared to my older sister, I worked hard in my lessons with the desire to surpass her someday. Plus, I genuinely loved music. There was one time I asked my parents if I could skip a lesson. I heard that my friend is having a birthday party next time. Can I skip the lesson on Friday? Since I never got to see friends outside of kindergarten, I asked my parents eagerly. Upon hearing this, my father responded with a smile, "You got invited to a birthday party? That's great." And in my childish mind, I understood that it meant, "Sure, you can go." I remember feeling even more excited and saying, "Yeah. We're going to eat cake together," in an excited manner. I hadn't been this excited since I entered kindergarten. But with one sentence from my mother that followed, my feelings were swiftly plummeted from heaven to hell. "You can't skip your lesson, can you? Stop saying such nonsense and eat quickly. Skipping means less practice time after eating, doesn't it?" But Daddy just... "We can't allow skipping lessons. And don't speak in a way that confuses Cindy." "Oh, right. Sorry." That evening's dinner, I left over half of it. Naturally, I couldn't focus on practicing after eating and was scolded by my mother 3 times more than usual. As this episode demonstrates, the one who held the reins in our house was my mother. It seems that my mother dreamed of becoming a musician from a young age. However, she couldn't fulfill that dream, so she entrusted those feelings to my sister and me. Looking back now, my mother's expectations of me were abnormal. I was sent to a music university-affiliated kindergarten, and after returning home, I had individual lessons 7 days a week and self-practice. Instead of family trips, we listened to performances by famous symphony orchestras, and birthday and Christmas presents were CDs from famous musicians or new sheet music. Furthermore, the living room was renovated into a practice room, where I spent almost all my time except for meals, bathing, and sleep. If I wanted to watch TV or read a book, I had to reduce mistakes in self-practice and finish practice on schedule. However, since it hardly ever finished on time, there were only a few days when my wishes were granted. I preferred playing the piano to watching TV, so it wasn't so hard for me, but my sister struggled every day to watch TV. However, despite her efforts, she rarely achieved results and secretly shed tears of frustration where our mother couldn't see. Seeing my sister like that all the time, I began to think, I need to get better for my sister's sake, and concentrated even more on my lessons. One day, when I was 4.5 years old, my mother suddenly said, "Maria, the violin suits you better, so we'll stop your piano lessons this month. On the other hand, Cindy will focus only on piano from next month. If you both master different instruments, you can aim for gold medals as sisters, and it will be splendid when you become famous, won't it?" and decided on our direction without consulting us. I didn't complain because I loved the piano, but my sister was also shocked because she loved the piano too. Still, there was no way we could voice our opinions to our mother. We just stayed silent and continued to follow the path she laid out for us. An incident occurred in our family when I was 5 years old. When I woke up in the morning, both of my cheeks were swollen and I had a high fever. Yes, I had caught mumps. Right before an important time like the competition, of all things, to get mumps. Well, as long as the fever goes down, you should be able to practice on your own, right? So my mother thought, and after confirming that the fever had subsided with fever reducers, she locked me in the practice room and made me practice on my own. I feel dizzy and can't play well. But if I don't do it properly, I'll get scolded again. At that time, I couldn't even tell my mother about my poor health. Then, a few days later, an unbelievable change occurred in my body, as I once again developed a high fever. Huh? Is my sister not practicing today? One day, when I woke up, the house was eerily silent. I couldn't hear a single sound. I ran downstairs from the children's room to the living room where the lesson room was located. Strangely enough, not a single noise was heard at this time. Feeling a horror movie-like fear, I forcefully opened the door to the practice room. There, I found my mother and sister practicing as usual. My mother, bustling down the stairs, seemed very angry with me. However, her angry words didn't reach my ears at all because I had lost my hearing completely at that moment. Sensing something was wrong with my strange reaction, my mother immediately took me to the hospital. And the diagnosis revealed that I had developed severe deafness, a rare complication of mumps. Subsequently, along with the complete recovery from mumps, my hearing slightly improved, but it became so impaired that I couldn't hear clearly unless spoken to loudly and slowly. Conversation with family and friends became difficult, and the days when I couldn't hear the beloved sound of the piano were filled with despair for me. But my mother felt even more despair than I did. I never thought it would come to this. But if this is how it turned out, then there's nothing we can do. Let's just give up on Cindy. Give up? What do you mean by give up? From now on, we'll focus all our efforts on Maria alone. Fortunately, we have 2 daughters. Even if Cindy fails, if Maria becomes a professional, that's all that matters. I see, understood. I'll follow your opinion. Soon after, I was forced to quit the piano, which I loved dearly. Without self-practice, I gained freedom, but with my hearing almost gone, watching TV or playing with friends felt joyless. Above all, not being allowed to even touch my beloved piano was the most painful thing. The following year, I was not accepted to the private elementary school I had planned to attend and instead enrolled in a public deaf school. From here on, I would be treated as a burden to the family. While my mother always attended my sister's school events, she completely ignored mine. If she absolutely had to attend, she would have my paternal grandparents go instead to maintain appearances. But this was still the better scenario. Mother increasingly avoided taking me out, from staying overnight in a hotel for my sister's competitions to concerts instead of our usual family trips. Ultimately, she even avoided everyday dining out with me. Every chance she got, she pushed me off to my grandparents. They always warmly embraced me to spare me from feeling miserable. Given such a household environment, it's no surprise my family never bothered to learn sign language for me. Unable to converse with my family, I began to isolate myself and withdraw at home. It was my grandparents who worried about me and helped me. Both of them attended sign language classes with me and learned sign language. Additionally, my grandmother, May, secretly learned lip reading and taught me. Thanks to their dedicated support, by the time I graduated from elementary school, I had acquired enough proficiency in sign language to have conversations with those who couldn't hear. It was around this time that I began to love and cherish my grandparents more than my biological parents. The decisive rift between me and my parents occurred when my sister was 15 and I was 13. I thought Maria could do it. International experience is absolutely necessary for a musician. Finally, the path to going abroad is open. On the evening of the day when the acceptance notice from the overseas music school arrived, my mother announced with unusually high spirits that my sister would be praised and that we would be moving abroad in a few months. It was at that moment that I first learned that my sister had planned to study abroad and that the move was confirmed upon her acceptance. I wasn't even told such an important thing. I can't use sign language in French. I wonder if sign language is the same over there? And I won't be able to see Grandma and Grandpa anymore. Despite the anxieties and worries that arose one after another, I felt somewhat reassured. But at least I'm being considered as part of the family. That's good. Thanks to my grandparents, I had developed a resilient spirit in adversity, so I vaguely felt like I'll manage somehow. And so, I thought positively about the move, believing that someday, when I stand on my own, I can go see my grandparents. A few months later, on the early morning of the day we were finally departing for overseas.
Cindy, wake up! We're leaving!
Huh? Really? Did I oversleep? This was the first time since losing my hearing that my mother woke me up. I mistakenly thought that I had overslept for my morning self-practice at the age of 4 and hurriedly jumped out of bed. But soon, I realized that it was just a misunderstanding. You won't wake up unless I speak this loud, huh? My throat will hurt. Hurry up and get ready, we're leaving. While saying so grudgingly, my mother closed the door roughly and left. Her gaze held no expectations, affection, or even concern for me. When I was a child, she used to look at me with much brighter eyes. Although fulfilling my mother's expectations was very difficult, those times when I received affection and concern from her, regardless of the form, felt strangely nostalgic and precious. While gazing around the empty room, I immersed myself in memories of my childhood for just a moment. And then, after taking a deep breath, I slowly stood up. I'll find something in this new place too. And I'll become someone who my mother can look at once again. As I put on the clothes I had prepared, I solidified my secret determination. However, in the next moment, this feeling of mine was shattered. Come on, let's go. Get in. My mother said as she waited in front of the entrance with only her handbag, holding all the luggage, after descending to the first floor. Huh? Wasn't the departure scheduled for 3 hours later? Despite my confusion about the schedule that was clearly different from what I had heard beforehand, I was too scared to talk to my clearly irritated mother. I was pushed into the taxi waiting outside as if being forced. Huh? Is no one else getting in? Despite the rush just now, there was no sign of my sister or father in the taxi. Then, please. However, my mother, who got in later, drove the taxi without any concern. And the destination we arrived at was not the airport but my grandparents' house. Cindy, get off. Please wait after unloading your luggage, it won't take long. At that moment, I felt a sense of unease from my mother's words and actions. That can't be true, right? No matter what, this is awful. While hoping that the thoughts in my head were just a figment of my imagination, I was so shocked that I couldn't move a step. Nevertheless, my mother, paying no attention to me, dragged me out of the taxi and rang the intercom at my grandparents' house. The two of them were just surprised to see their daughter-in-law and granddaughter suddenly appear without any prior notice in the early morning. But my mother, without any concern, said, "Since this child is useless to take along, I'll leave her here," and threw my luggage into my grandparents' house. Then, hastily getting into the taxi, she said, "Okay, please. Don't contact me unless it's a matter of life and death," and drove away. And truly, it was just the three of us, the family, who moved abroad. Am I a nuisance because I can't hear? Am I being abandoned because I can't become a musician? Even though I was deprived of my beloved piano, even though I couldn't have a proper conversation, even though I couldn't be taken out with the family, I had always hoped that someday we would understand each other because we were family. And just a moment ago, I had resolved to strive to earn my mother's recognition once again. The despair I felt at that moment was more painful and sorrowful than the day I lost my hearing. But I didn't succumb to despair again. That was thanks to my grandmother. I never thought someone could be so cruel. But from now on, you can truly do what you love, Cindy. What I love? Yes. Not because someone tells you to do it, but because you want to do it, Cindy. Is there something you want to do? There was, but it's impossible. Someone like me. It's okay. You'll see soon enough. With these words, my grandmother continued to encourage me with her gentle smile that enveloped me. Encouraged by my grandmother, I decided to play the piano again. The sound of the beloved piano, which I hadn't been allowed to touch for years, stimulated my faint remaining hearing like nothing else. I want to play the piano again. Like I used to. My wilted heart swelled up as if it had exploded. And from that moment on, my days filled with piano resumed. I was now a fourth-year student at a music university. Before entering, there were struggles beyond the ordinary, but I loved music and felt fulfilled and emotional in my life with friends who shared conversations about music. After entering university, I also challenged myself in genres such as songwriting and composition, and I learned the joy of studying music from new perspectives. When I was abandoned at my grandmother's house, I felt like I had been plunged into the depths of despair in life, but looking back, it seems like it was the catalyst for becoming who I am now, so it's not as bitter. I also gained the strength and confidence to think like this. It was truly smooth sailing. But one day, an unexpected event occurred. My mother, who had been out of touch for years, suddenly appeared before me. She came to the university unannounced, just like when she abandoned me years ago, without any prior notice. And upon seeing me, she smiled as if she were a different person and exclaimed, "Congratulations on winning the international piano competition. You're truly my child after all," and began to get excited. I was bewildered and couldn't use sign language or speak. Then, my mother, perhaps misunderstanding something, forcibly grabbed both of my hands tightly and said, "Sorry for surprising you. I heard about you on the news and flew here," as she tried to hug me. Instinctively, I vehemently rejected her. For a moment, my mother exclaimed, "Huh," but then returned to her previous smile and said, "Thank you for fulfilling my dream of becoming a musician. You're amazing, Cindy. From now on, I'll support you with all my might. I'll support you not only in your work, but also in your private life. Let's live together from now on," she said, pressing me. I felt an eerie chill from my mother's strange gaze, the first time I'd ever experienced such a thing. Just when I wanted desperately to escape from this situation, I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder from behind, and when I turned around, a university friend stood there with a worried expression. My friend signed, "What's wrong? Are you okay?" I also signed back, "I'm in trouble because a stranger is bothering me. Can you come home with me?" My friend nodded vigorously and intervened between my mother and me, saying, "Sorry, we have plans to go out. Excuse us," and then took my hand and led me away from the scene. It seemed my mother hadn't learned sign language as before. She stood there looking puzzled and stunned. Was my mom always this weird? Perhaps living apart from her made me finally realize her abnormality at this age. And for the first time, I decided I never wanted to be involved with her again. However, contrary to my feelings, a few days later, my mother showed up at my grandparents' house with my father and sister in tow. "I'm sorry for surprising you the other day. Actually, we plan to return home soon. So, let's be together from now on." Smiling brightly, my mother's demeanor remained unchanged, still authoritative. And behind her, my father stood weakly, and my sister hunched her shoulders, just as they always had. Pretending not to understand what I was saying and remaining silent deliberately, my mother suddenly began to praise me lavishly, for reasons unknown. But the content of her praise was incomprehensible, saying it was the result of the early childhood education or that Cindy inherited my genes, so her talent blossomed even when we were apart. Not only that, but she also criticized my sister, saying that since the violin didn't work out well, we tried piano later, but it didn't work out either, so she simply didn't have talent, and it was a waste of time and money. Such conversation continued for more than 10 minutes, and my sister eventually burst into tears. Seeing my sister like that, I felt a pang in my chest, remembering myself at the age of 5 when I lost my hearing and had my piano taken away. And I felt an intense anger toward my mother, who was manipulating mine and my sister's lives for her own values. However, my mother, who had been silent, began to feel irritated with me. Yet, she probably didn't want to spoil my mood. With an eerie smile that only reached her lips, she began typing something on her smartphone. On the screen, it said, "You are the greatest musician. That's why I came to pick you up." I deliberately replied in sign language that I wouldn't go with her. My mother, who didn't understand sign language, forced a smile while her lips twitched slightly. Then she showed me the screen again, saying, "Let's go home together." I sighed and replied on my phone's screen, saying, "I'm staying here because my grandparents are worried." I made an unbelievable suggestion to my grandmother, who was next to me. "That's right. From now on, I'll leave Maria here. That way, Cindy can focus on her musical activities, and I can fully support her. Maria can finally be useful to the family. Could you please tell Mom that Maria will stay here so she doesn't have to worry?" My mother's selfishness made something inside me snap.
Don't say such selfish things. I don't need support from a mother who abandoned me, and I'm not planning to leave this house. Don't ever show up in front of us again.
Before I knew it, I found myself yelling at my mother for the first time in my life. My mother, who had assumed I couldn't hear the conversation, as well as everyone else present, fell silent for a moment. But my mother didn't back down at all. "Cindy doesn't need support, there's no way that's true. After all, you're my daughter. You're going to become a great musician with me in the future. And pretending not to hear anymore, you're not a child anymore, so stop being selfish."
It's not pretending, I just read your lips to understand the conversation. Besides, why bother learning sign language when you're living with a hearing-impaired person? And don't act like a mother now after abandoning me 9 years ago. You dare to say such things to your parents. It's all because of your grandparents. I'll fix even your foul mouth. Come on, hurry up and pack your things.
I have no intention of living with you, and I don't plan to be involved with you in the future. Please take your belongings.
You can't just say things like that. I'll pack your things by myself then.
Thinking she couldn't persuade me, my mother forcefully began to enter the house. I desperately tried to stop my mother, who had lost the ability to make rational judgments. Then, my grandmother, who had been silently observing the situation, stood in front of my mother with a phone in her hand. In a slightly menacing tone, she said, "If you try to enter the house, I'll call the police for trespassing. Maybe I should also apply for a restraining order for stalking," and stared sharply at my mother with a piercing gaze. It was shocking to see such a fierce expression from my usually calm grandmother. And seemingly, even my mother regained her senses. She sat down weakly on the spot and started sobbing, asking why things had turned out this way. My sister and even my father, who had been silent, just watched. In the end, scolded by my grandfather for being noisy, my father, with my sister's help, dragged my mother away and took her home. I wondered what my father thought of us. As I watched my exhausted father's back disappear, I felt like I would never have the opportunity to ask. While patting me on the back, my grandmother, with her usual gentle smile, asked, "Do you remember when I told you that you'd understand past and present?" I quietly replied, "Yes," nodding my head. Then, my grandmother spoke with a distant look in her eyes. "That's it, that's the situation right now. Children aren't tools for parents. Forcing them to succeed rarely works. Cindy always had musical talent. Even though she lost her hearing and faced difficulties, I believed Cindy, a hard worker, could overcome it. Thanks, Grandma," I said, giving her a tight hug and shedding a few tears. I felt grateful to be their grandchild. It was a moment of sincere gratitude. Despite this, my mother kept visiting, but we didn't respond at all. But no matter how cold we were, my mother's desire for me to become a musician only seemed to grow stronger and worsen. During that time, my father surprisingly visited my grandparents' house. When asked by my grandfather if something was wrong, my father, with a dejected expression, said he was looking for Maria. And when my grandfather inquired further, he learned that Maria's situation had become even more tragic than before.
"Why can't you even play this piece? You won't even be able to participate in competitions like this," my mother scolded.
"I'm sorry, Mom, I'm really sorry.
I've devoted all my money, time, and life to you. So why haven't you become a musician?"
It seemed my mother, obsessed with becoming a musician, had started harshly criticizing Maria, who couldn't produce results. She had endured enough until now, but this time, she reached her breaking point. And one day, she ran away with a piano tuner she had met only a few months ago. "You've only known him for a few months. It's obvious you'll struggle being with such an unfamiliar guy. So, I thought I'd bring you back and try to convince you." My father seemed genuinely worried about my sister. But honestly, when I heard this story, I felt a little relieved. I thought, it'd be nice if my sister could start her own life now. That's why I felt relieved. In the end, she is still missing, and although I'm deeply concerned about her safety, I can't help but wish she's found happiness away from my mother's reach. Meanwhile, my mother, abandoned not only by me, but also by Maria, spends every day shut inside the house, resembling a recluse, my father said. And every time he refused, my father would receive verbal abuse and sometimes even have things thrown at him. Unable to endure such a life any longer, my father eventually left my mother with only a completed divorce papers left behind. When my father left, my mother caused a commotion, and even when she came to my grandparents' house, she looked at them with pleading eyes, begging for me, as if she had no one else left. And I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine, realizing that this person, no matter what happens, will never change, only ever thinking of herself. When my father left, my mother immediately started working to support herself, but none of her jobs lasted long, and she ended up changing jobs frequently. And a few times a month, she comes to my grandparents' house, shouting for Cindy to be returned. I made a bold proposal to protect my grandparents' livelihood. It was to move. Now that I have a stable income as a professional pianist, I thought we could live safely and comfortably with my grandparents. At first, they were hesitant, but when I explained my thoughts, they willingly agreed to move. And now, my grandparents and I live peacefully in a condominium in the city. We also sold my grandparents' land along with the move, so we'll never return to that town again. With this move, I finally felt like I had gained control of my own life. And it seemed the same for my grandparents. They were delighted to have peaceful days they could live without worry. Recently, as they've aged, they've had more medical appointments, but they still never miss one of my concerts. And they always praise, "You were amazing," as expected of Cindy, without fail. I was happier in this moment than anything else. I want to continue to cherish the two who have always been on my side no matter what. And secretly, I want to give back to them the same amount of love they poured into me, starting from now.